Okay, so today we're going to talk about reflective learning. You have handouts in front of you. Perhaps you could just close them and just leave them, because actually I don't want you to go going through them in head, because you'll see why later. It spoils the exercises. The way we're going to work today is really that what I'm doing with you is encompassed by two large exercises. The first one will take over an hour and will probably be fairly soon, this half of the morning. The other one we'll do in the other half of the morning, I think, and that will take a little bit less time, but for me those are the two sort of key bits of work I'll do with you. Nearly everything else is written in the handout anyway. In fact, nearly everything you need is in the handout. Handout material is free to use. You don't need to ask me. The exercises, well, particularly the first exercise I'm going to do with you, which is called the park, an exercise called the park, that is designed for use directly with students. And you are completely free to use it. I think these materials will be on the website, so you just download them, copy them, do what you like with them. Modify them if you want to, that's fine. Or write your own, based on them, that's even better. Okay, I'm just thinking through a number of things I want to say to you first. Let's just talk about how I'm going to cover this. I always do this with some trepidation because I never know quite, depending on how much discussion we have, I'm not quite sure how much we'll cover, but we'll cover most of this. So I want to talk very briefly to start with just about where I come from in terms of reflection and reflective learning, how I see it. Then I think I'll probably go straight into the exercise which is to do with factors that affect the quality of reflection. And the exercise that at that point I'll be doing is around introducing reflection to students. How do you get them started? And also helping them to see the depth of reflection. What we don't want them to do is just write descriptions. We need them to reflect reasonably deeply, because only then will they learn from their reflection. And I think it takes a bit of effort to get them to reflect at some depth. After that, I'll probably come back and briefly talk about reflection and learning and reflection and emotion. I don't want to spend much time on those. If you want more on that sort of material, it's kind of lecture material, or it's written in my book, the blue book there. Then I will do the work around the learner's conception of knowledge, because this is an exercise, again, the second big exercise, which I think it directly relates to reflecting at depth or improving the thinking of students, which is, after all, what this is all about, the thinking and the learning. Okay, now then assessment, the all-important assessment, I will cover that. It won't take all that long, but I will cover that as well towards the end. Again, if you have to go early, because I know one or two of you do, the materials are in the handout, so I do tend to make handouts that cover most of what I'm going to say. I know you could pick them up and walk away now, but it's not quite the same, is it? I may talk about some exercises to promote reflection. I'm talking there about the kind of exercises that you might use with students writing a learning journal or a log. If I don't do that, there's a handout about learning journals, which again I sent to Amal this morning, and that will be on the website, and that has all lots of exercises in it, or they're written out in my book of 2006, or they're on the website. At the front of your handouts, don't need to look just at the moment, there's a set of resources that you can use, and there's a lot of material from the books on the website at Bournemouth. And it's all free to use, no copyright issues at all. Right, what else do I need to say to you? Okay, now this is an informal workshop. I don't run formal workshops, that's why I'm standing here behind there with a microphone. So I'm not going to use PowerPoint very much. I just really use it for 1 or 2 slides. If there's nothing on the PowerPoint that you don't have in your handout, so don't feel you need the slides. I always say to people, don't print them, you don't need it. that's about it. I first came across reflection as an idea. I suppose I'd been involved with reflective learning for many years because I've been involved in counselling and the sort of things to do with group work and so on in the 70s and 80s. And I think I first came across reflection in an academic context when I was working in health education, health promotion. I was developing short courses for staff who were not involved in health education directly. They were nurses and teachers and police and the sort of people who had a role in health education, potentially sometimes, but weren't directly trained in it. So they were invited to short courses, and it was usual they'd be invited to a short course. They would have great difficulty in extricating themselves from their day-to-day work. They'd come on the course, they'd probably quite enjoy the course, and they'd learn lots and think this is great, and then they'd go back to their day-to-day work the next day, and the stuff would have piled up on their desks, and they would really, having learned things, they would just not have time to put them into action, and wouldn't really have thought through how those new ideas related to their day-to-day action. And I was trying to think about how we could improve this situation, and getting them to reflect seemed to be a good way of doing it. So we talked, for example, one of the main things was to split the day into two, so that there were 2 half days, so that ideas introduced on the first day could be expected to reflect on those ideas between the 2 short courses. They were asked to think about things like what is it you do on a day-to-day basis in health education? How could this, with these new ideas, how could your current practice be modified to improve the health education work you do? So they were asked to do a lot more reflection about the new material and how it related to their day-to-day jobs. So that's really where some of my ideas arose from, and at that point I was starting to do a PhD, and it became the subject matter of my PhD and books later. Okay, I'm going to start properly by talking a bit about what I call the vocabulary of reflection. This is just looking at a few words and putting in a few ideas. Yesterday. So don't worry if I'm flipping through these, I'm just picking out 1 or 2 of the slides that I want to use. Okay, now, within the first sentence, I think, of writing the first book I wrote on reflection, I came across a problem. Was I going to use the word reflection or reflective learning? And I decided to use the 2 words, to make the 2 words have the same meaning. So when I talk about reflection or reflective learning, I'm talking about the same thing. You know, it could be very confusing if you're a student and I was talking about reflection in one moment and reflective learning in another. So it is important to kind of be clear about terms like that. Reflection and reflective practice are what I would call constructed terms. They don't have a sort of, it's not as if the brain is always doing the same thing when we reflect. It's an observed behaviour that we use a word to describe. And actually that's something I need to come back to. I'm just reminding myself something I haven't said yet. So what has happened, and there are many, many constructed terms in education. I would say learning. The word learning is another one. People interpret these ideas in lots of different ways. We know broadly what we mean by these words, but we have sort of different theories, different ideas, different bits of literature we draw on in order to describe them. And I think that for students that's extremely difficult because they expect there to be one thing that's reflection, or one thing that is learning, or one thing that is some of these other constructed terms. And actually their teachers may have different ideas about them. And that's actually an idea we'll come back to. Okay, the thing I had meant to say, and I hadn't said earlier, and I'd like you just to bear this in mind, it was an issue that arose the other day, is I don't know that there is a direct translation of reflection in Arabic. Is that, I'm throwing that to you because I don't know. But it is quite frequent that there isn't a word for reflection in another language, a second language or a first language, where students are working in the both. And it's important to just think about that when you're talking to them. So just bear that in mind. You need to do that little bit of translation if you know, in your way. Not. Some people said yesterday there were equivalent words, but others said there aren't. So you see, there's disagreement already. Okay, reflective writing. This is where a little bit of thinking comes in. If I look reflective, I might be sort of looking a bit dreamily at this. You don't know if I'm reflecting or not. Because I'm reflecting in my head, if I'm reflecting at all. I might be thinking of my dinner tonight or something like that. You don't know. You don't know whether your students are learning or not. It goes on in their heads. You only know if I am reflecting or indeed learning. If I represent that reflection. I can represent my reflection in writing, in drawing a picture, in doing a dance or a mime, in music, in speech. There are lots of different ways of representing reflection. But I would say that that process of representation is another stage. Now, I would say we learn from representing our reflection. So, and I think that because, for example, I would say my reflections are, it's like thinking it's multi-dimensional. They are thoughts that kind of relate to other memories and other bits of theory and all sorts of things. When I write down that reflection, I have to put it into a linear sequence. I have to organise it. And in organising it, in reorganising my thoughts, I think I learn more about it. So I would say that when we represent our reflection in writing, we learn from the process of doing that. And I'm going to introduce another word here. In fact, I must remember to add it to the list. The word secondary reflection. I would use the word secondary reflection for situations where we reflect on the reflection we have already done. Okay, so if I have written some written reflections in a journal or a log, and I engage in secondary reflection, I reread what I have written, and I think about it again, and I might write about it again. Now, I would argue that we actually learn the most from situations in which we make sure, students learn the most from situations in which we make sure they have to reread any reflective writing they've done. I will come back to that right at the end of the session when I talk about assessment. Because I think getting students to go back through their raw written reflection is actually a key to they're really getting them to learn from their thinking. It's that process as well. Now, going back to reflective writing, I've talked about writing as one form of representation, but I said there are others. There's drawing, there's speech. Now, I think we learn different things from representing our reflection in different ways. So I think in writing, I learn one aspect of my reflection. But if I draw a picture to represent, I mean, I don't mean a beautiful drawing. I mean maybe a cartoon or an abstract or just a mass of colour, whatever. I think I learn different things about that reflection. I suspect that when we draw, we learn more about the emotional side of reflection. And I think we perhaps miss out on an opportunity with students to increase the depth and breadth of their reflection because we don't ask them to draw on the whole. So I would suggest that's another thing to do with students, to get them to represent some of their reflection in a picture of some sort, in graphic form. It doesn't need to take long, but it's worth, I think, that we learn more about what's going on there. Okay. I want to now talk for a few moments about my definition of reflection. Now, I said it's a constructed term. In other words, there are lots of different definitions about reflection, and that's really why and because it's constructed, and because you're going to do an exercise that I designed, it's important for you to get a feel for how I see reflection. If you're working with students on reflection, I think it's rather important that you say to students, this is how I see reflection. The problem is that students who are in their early years of education, of higher education, they will kind of expect there to be one right definition. And it is possible that in different modules they'll come across different definitions, and they won't understand how it can be that there are different definitions of the same thing. Now, just bear with that. I've said that. I'm going to come back to it in the second big exercise, because it is exactly about that sort of thing, about students understanding, not the structure of knowledge. Okay, how do I see reflection? I'm just going to pull out some one or two things around my definition, and then I'll show you the definition. But I don't think my definition is particularly important. I don't think it's worth remembering it or anything like that. It's just me telling you where I come from. Okay, I think that reflection is a process, and usually there's some kind of starting point. I think I'm going to reflect on, how well I ran the course yesterday, or how well I ran the class yesterday, or whatever. Okay, some sort of input. Then we reflect, and there is some sort of outcome or result. It may be that we do a bit of learning. In fact, I know that I'm already doing that today, because I reflected a bit about how I ran the course yesterday and what I didn't say yesterday, and I've said it better today, for example. So I've already done that reflection, and I've changed my practice as a result. However, there are many times when we actually are just like sitting in the sun, enjoying or in the shade, enjoying relaxing, and ideas float into our head. And I don't want to cut out that kind of reflection from my definition. It does happen. We suddenly found ourselves thinking about something, reflect on it for a bit, and there may be an outcome, or we may go back to it and reflect more on it later. Okay, so that's it's a process. I think we reflect on material that is complex and not simple. Now, for example, I might say, let me start again. I don't think I would say I'm going to reflect on the route to the bus stop. I think I would say I'll think about it, or I'll plan it, or I'll remember it. However, I can't tell how complex an idea is to other people, because if I'm disabled and I'm in a wheelchair and have to think about the curbs and the route, then I might well reflect on one route to the bus stop as opposed to another, which is going to be better for me. So in other words, we can't prejudge what is a complex idea or a simple idea to any given person. One day I said, I don't reflect on a chair, on the design of a chair, but then I thought, well, if I design chairs as a way of life, I do reflect on it, because I will reflect on how the design relates to other designs and whether it's comfortable and all those sorts of things. So we can't prejudge what is complex or simple, but I think on the whole, reflection is a kind of thinking, but it's a bit more precise than that, and it deals with complex ideas. I think emotion is involved in reflection, but I wouldn't say reflection is special because of the emotional content. Some people who write about reflection have said that. I think emotion affects us all the time and in every respect. I don't see emotion in one side of my mental life and cognition on the other. I think they are completely mixed up. As I will say later, I think if I have a bad night and get up feeling cross, that probably affects the way in which I would reflect or learn or function mentally for some hours. So I think they're linked up. I think we reflect largely on what we know already. Right. I think reflection is largely a reordering of what we have in our heads already. And I shall illustrate that in a moment. I think I'll show you the definition now, and you'll see these ideas are caught up in the definition. I've probably forgotten one or two bits, but it doesn't matter. There you are, that's the first part of the definition. And I call it common sense. It's a kind of everyday definition. Oh, by the way, this is on your handouts. You can turn your handouts over, but you don't. Yeah, it's on the front of your handout. Now, I just used this definition for a long while, and then I realised that usually because I was talking in an academic context, actually reflection is slightly different when you're using it with students. And so I devised another few words to add to this for an academic situation. In particular, when students have to write reflectively, they very often are told, what the subject matter that they have to reflect on, and they are expected to have some sort of outcome, and they are, very often, their work is looked at. Now, if I'm a student and my reflective writing is going to be looked at, I will write it, I will edit it according to what I think the tutor wants to see. I have a story about that. It was a friend who was doing a PhD on this subject matter some years ago, and she had asked some students who were learning to be teachers, higher education students who were learning to be teachers, about the journals that they had to write about their teaching practice. And she asked them what they thought their tutor wanted to see in their journals. And they said, plenty of, now this is a word you might, I don't know, plenty of self-flagellation. Okay, you understand that word. They wanted to see plenty of kind of looking at their weaknesses, an examination of their weaknesses. So of course, what the tutor got in the journals is plenty of self-flagellation, plenty of discussion of their weaknesses, not of their strengths. I think the point is, and some people have said to me, well, why do we get students to write reflectively and we look at it, and of course what students write is what they think we want to see. I had to think about that. I think it is worthwhile because, now let's just look at it, something happens in, say, teaching practice that doesn't go terribly well. The student knows she has to write reflectively for her tutor about it. So she thinks about the event, she reflects on it and the weaknesses she's shown, but what she actually writes down is a modified version for her tutor. So she changes reality so it doesn't look so bad. So the tutor sees the modified version. But if you think through that sequence, the very fact that she has to write something for her tutor has forced her to reflect on the event in a real way. And even if what the tutor sees is a modified version of it, we have caused that reflection to happen. So sometimes what you see is it's nothing like reality. It'll be fiction in all terms. But nevertheless, it will have caused the student to do that reflection in the first place. So I think that's, that for me means it is worthwhile using reflective journals, even if you know that what you see is not always accurate. What's accuracy anyway? It's only in the eye of the beholder. Okay, I'm going to show you my definition, the bit that I add in academic context, and you'll see that that fits in there. Okay, but these are only words, and what's really important about reflection is that you get a sense of what it is you want your students to be doing. I've kind of, over the years, lost my faith in language as a means of describing everything in the way that we fully need to describe it. No, that doesn't quite make sense, but I think you probably get the gist of it. I think sometimes there are ideas that we have to pass over to students. I think that there are a lot of ideas that students have to learn that can't be described directly in language. And actually, I would hate to be in a situation where students were saying to me, you know, reflective writing, what do you mean? What is it? Because I wouldn't know. I mean, giving them a definition is not going to help. However, showing them what it looks like is much more helpful. And I think probably in higher education we don't use, you know, showing people what things look like as much as perhaps we could or should. Okay, so I'm going to move now into this exercise that really does these two things. It shows students what reflective writing looks like, but also it deals with deepening that reflection on the basis that very descriptive writing, you know, just writing a story out, isn't going to be something students will learn an awful lot from. They will learn more if they can write in a deeper manner. And so we do need them to write reasonably deeply. But the fact is that unless students are shown what deeper reflection looks like, the chances are they won't get beyond rather superficial description. So they need that encouragement and demonstration. The way the exercise works, okay, it's based on a story about an event that happens. The one I'm going to use, I've done 7 of these exercises. The ones I most use are one called the GP story, which I did in London for some of you, and one called the park, and the park is the one I probably use most. It's a story about an event that happens in the park, that's all. It's written at 4 levels in terms of depth of reflection. So there are 4 accounts of the same events at different depths. Now you'll have to bear with me when I talk about the notion of depth. I have done a lot of reading. It's based very much in existing research, but I'm not going to give you that research here and now. It's written in the book and in other places. So there's no theory here, this is just pure practice. Okay, the way this works is that I'm going to get you in a moment to read the first account of the park. And when I can see that most of you finished reading it, I shall get you to discuss how reflective that account is. The first account is not very reflective at all. When I've let you discuss it for a few moments, I shall say, now, okay, read the second account. Then you'll discuss it. Then the third account, and then you'll discuss it. Then the fourth account, and you'll discuss it. And then I shall get you to think about what has changed between the first very descriptive account and the fourth account. So I want you to bear that in mind as we go. It's not just one thing that changes. There are lots of different ways in which the text changes, different things that run right the way through that change the way the text is written. And what I think helps students to write at depth reflectively is to kind of be aware of those changes, of those things that make reflection deeper. Okay. Right. So, there are instructions in your handout on how to run this, because as I say, this is material for students, although I end up mostly running the teaching staff. The instructions on how to run it are on page 5. And if you go over to page 6, you'll find the first account. Don't start reading just yet. What I think you might find it helpful to use a pen just to underline bits that you think are reflective, so that you can go back and talk about it. Just another thing is that although you're sitting around tables, and it's because of this exercise and indeed the next that I've got you arranged in this way, I have run this exercise in a big lecture theatre with students lined up, with hundreds of students. And I suppose because it's story-based and quite engaging, it works quite well. But one thing I think is really important, and you'll see this possibly in action, I think it's really important that when people are reading, there is silence, and when people are discussing, they can discuss. But when I say, start reading it again, I'm really clear that I need everyone to be quiet.
Maybe one that has constructed reference.
You just like to understand.
I think segregated she meant the links, maybe, but not the event.
Yes, not the link, exactly. What's the story? The bullying.
Brilliant.
She is questioning realize she constructed it retrospectively based on this event.
Interesting, I think I would say the bullying link maybe retrospectively fabricated. Maybe that will help explain our point of view versus yours.
Okay, I'm going to move the exercise on now to the next phase.
It's very
We're going to move the exercise on now. Okay. What I want you now to do, sorry. What I want you now to do is to start thinking about what has changed from the first account to the fourth. Now, it's not like just one thing has changed, it's a whole sequence of different things that make that fourth account much more reflective. Well, I think you'll agree, it's deeper. Okay, so what I mostly want you to do in this exercise is to think about what are those changes. The way I want you to go about that thinking is obviously to talk about it, but also to depict it in some way on the sheet of paper you've got. I've given you 2 pens. I don't mind how you do it, but what I don't want you to do, well, in which case I do mind how you do it slightly, what I don't want you to do is write account 1 and describe account 1, account 2 and describe account 2. I want you to think about what's changing across the accounts. Okay, now there's one, I've got about a list of 8 or 9 things that change. And what I will do when you finish doing that is to go around the tables and ask for one change from each table, and we'll go around as many times as we need to. Just some of the changes don't start changing in the first account. They change really only in the fourth and fifth, sorry, third and fourth accounts, okay. So really they just kick in at the end there. So you have now around a quarter of an hour, but I'll see how you go, to depict in some way the changes. You can do it as a graph or pictures, whatever you like, I don't mind. Now, in terms of you being teachers and running this exercise, clearly this bit is not really possible to do if you've got a lecture theatre full of students. You can get them to think about the changes though and write them down on a sheet of paper. I think this exercise works better if you can put this phrase in, but as I say, it's not essential. I think it helps to gel the groups and it helps to mean that the discussion is prolonged about the changes, and that's what we're really after. Okay, so I'll leave you to see where you get to. If you want a spare sheet of paper to do a trial drawing, I'll probably put It was just a scrap in case you wanted to try something out. I'm not going to get you to show these to anyone, so I'll show this for you.
Does that make sense?
It's intensive, it's lovely, intensive.
Yeah.
Where's the chance?
Okay, that's okay for me. Can somebody draw it? Maybe I'll be it. How would you draw that? Explicit or not. B for brain. Or A for
Oh, the child.
What is with the word that
I think it does say. I don't think the gender of the child has the gender of the reflector might be
really messy.
Who actually works on it?
And there's a self-instruction one as well. Get to discussing this obviously better when we have this discussion. But if they can't, you do. Okay, I think we'll draw this together now. Okay, now at this stage, what I do is go around each table and ask for one thing that has changed. But I will ask you to, at some stage, during the break, have a look at each other's ways of drawing it. Sometimes people are a bit disappointed because they put huge effort into their drawing, and I'm not really directly interested in that. But you know, you can have a look at what you've done. I do find this getting this drawing done, however people do it, is helpful in the sense that you've sat round and talked about it for a quarter of an hour, and that's useful. So, I'm going to go around the tables and ask for one thing that's changed from each of you, and we'll see where we get to. Okay, tell me one thing that's changed, your table.
One thing which changed was the level of emotions.
Right, okay.
So that increased from one store to the other one.
And in this particular sequence, the park, and this doesn't happen quite so much in the others that I've written, the third one is very emotional, I know that. And I thought of changing it, and I thought, well, actually, in reality, that kind of real involvement and emotion can happen, so I will leave it. But, if you write your own material, they don't need to get quite so emotional as that. However, I think she does learn from that. So the first account was hardly anything emotional. I think it was just a little bit of something about, oh, I have a feeling about this. Then it grows. The third one is very emotional. The fourth one, some people say, is less reflective because the emotion is less there. But I don't see reflection as directly associated with the amount of emotion. I think she is standing back, and actually that's another point I'm looking for. She's kind of actually knows that there's a lot of feeling, but she's actually standing back enough to be able to talk about it and to see where it's coming from a bit.
Just a question here. Don't you think that the whole reflection, the process itself, starts with a surge of emotion, and you understand me? It starts with a surge of emotion.
Sometimes.
Before that, you start,
Right.
going into the reflective process.
When I talk about emotion and reflection, sometimes I agree, a surge of emotion is what kicks us into reflecting. But not necessarily. I mean, you might well be asking students to reflect on a bit of practice they've done. So it doesn't have to be something that's highly emotional. But yes, more naturally, I suppose, when we're not in an academic situation, if we are suddenly emotional, that may well kick us into reflecting. But emotion has lots of different relationships to reflection and learning than just that. But yes, that's a good point, thank you. Okay, let's just go on round. In fact, I'm going to ask your table to tell me the next thing that changes anyway. I want to, on the whole, go around and get these points out, then we can discuss the various issues that arise. Tell me one other thing that changes across the accounts.
From the first to the last, she also, especially in the last one, she got other people's input into her reflection.
Right, it's more like the third and the fourth for that. Okay, now, if you think about it, if she reflected on her own, without reference to anyone else, she would only be able to reflect on her own perceptions of the event. Okay, in ways that I'll talk about later, she could expand that, but she can only reflect on she's seen and what's in her head. By talking to other people and getting their viewpoints, their perspectives, she is recognizing that they may have different perspectives, and that has expanded her reflection. In an academic situation, we use literature or networking to get those other perspectives, and then we draw that together in our reflection. But yes, getting those other viewpoints is really important. Thank you. Right, and I think that's really just the third and fourth accounts. It doesn't really happen earlier.
Can I just mention something? Even in the first one, Dania noted that there's a mention of a James says, I should not worry.
Right. Yes, actually, thank you. That is true. There is a mention of somebody saying, don't worry, which, yeah, you could almost say that's like a viewpoint. It is, actually, yes. I noticed that. Tell me.
Just to add to that, she starts the first two in the first person and then the second to the third person, right? So there's a shift away from herself.
Yes. So that's, hold on to that,
Okay.
you can give me that as a point.
Sure.
Tell me something else that changes.
Especially in the last one, she's reflecting about the reflective process itself and starting to learn about herself through doing this.
Okay, that is what I would call metacognition or reflexivity. People sometimes use those words slightly differently. And actually, it's really interesting. Yesterday, somebody came up with that one very early on, and it's not something that people notice quite often. It's often one I fill in with. Okay, when you reflect at depth, or indeed when you do critical thinking at depth, you do think through your own processes of reflecting or critical thinking or learning, or whatever it is. So she's thinking about, have I made assumptions? Have I gone down tracks that perhaps aren't the best? And, you know, are there other things I need to think about? So that's a really important characteristic of deep reflection, is reflection on the process of reflection.
How is that different from what we call secondary reflection? Could that be part of the secondary reflection?
In a way, yes, it could, but secondary reflection is probably more than that. Because it's looking at the content as well, whereas this is actually the focus on the process.
That's what disturbed me about the fourth reflection. I felt it's not authentic, genuine reflection.
Right.
You see, the third one has more...
It's more direct.
Yes, it's more genuine. It's reflecting on the incident itself.
Yes.
And it's better than the first two. The fourth one is interesting. It is a reflection on the reflective process. But it's not as authentic because I'm not reflecting on the situation. I'm reflecting on the reflective process again.
Right.
What is missing here? What can I add? So it's not genuine. It didn't strike me as genuine.
Right, well, it obviously isn't genuine in the sense that it is constructed. Half of it, I'm
It's
getting caught up in
constructed.
discussions.
Exactly.
I really would like to go through the... No, just hold for a moment. Let me go on through. Yeah, well, it's something other people have said too. I mean, in the end, you work on your own view of what reflection is. I mean, I think in an academic context, the fourth one is the useful one, in the sense that she can learn better from it. In the third one, she's very caught up in the emotions. And when you're caught up in emotions, it's actually difficult sometimes to, if I say, see the wood for the trees, you are caught up and feeling, you actually need to step out of that and be able to make your judgments beyond that, I think. But it doesn't matter. I mean, I've said this is all constructive thought, and, you know, the authenticity and so on are issues that are, you know, artificial in the sense that it's an artificial exercise. But thanks for the point. Right, tell me something else that
I
changes.
don't know if this has been mentioned, but she relates the experience to other experiences. And
No,
in
it
that
hasn't
sense
been mentioned.
Networks the...
Right, that is different from getting other people's viewpoints. If I am reflecting, again, on my own, sorry, I am reflecting on my own. I have in my head various prior experiences that will direct the way in which my reflection goes. They will determine how I view this thing. My prior experiences determine how I view this thing. She needs to be aware of that. And she might be, you know, actually thinking of other, you know, drawing in, rather deliberately thinking of other memories that are relevant, that help her or perhaps are getting in the way of this. So yes, and that again is something that really only occurs in the last two accounts, not really the first two. Right.
But also in the fourth, she has that she's not sure.
Yes.
So it opens up for changes.
Yes, and there could be a fifth and sixth, and you know. Right. Tell me something else that changes.
So the one to come back to is the point of view change, right?
Right.
So she begins with the first person. It's more about her to begin with, but then she starts kind of looking outside herself and describing
Right.
the event itself.
Can I give you a word for that?
Sure.
And it is a word I've used.
Okay.
She is standing back from the
Right,
event.
exactly.
Time is probably passing.
Right.
And that's an interesting issue. I think, and this is only really from actually me dabbling around with reflecting on events and then observing how, what happens to my writing. I think that when you are right on top of an event, especially if there is an emotional content, that you get caught up in it and you need to pull back from it. And actually most useful reflection is when a little bit of time has passed. Now that's relevant to the way you might use reflection in the classroom. Are you thinking getting students to think of something that happened two weeks ago or yesterday? When are you getting them to write about the events that you're getting them to reflect on? And that will make a difference. But that's a decision for you, you need to be aware of that difference. So standing back from the event is a characteristic of deeper reflection. And there's a sense also of standing back, I get a wider view of it. As if I'm right up front, all I can see is that. If I stand back, I can see it in its general context better.
But you can still compare. Let's say if you write a diary,
Yes.
like right after the incident, and then look at it again, and then reflect on what you wrote. Then it's metacognitive.
That, in a sense, yes, that's where it's being secondary, yes. So then it is
cyclical. I mean,
yes.
I know, let's say, in education and social work, when we train students, we work on this.
Yes.
But the idea that you have to revisit what
Right.
you reflected on.
And actually, I said early on that secondary reflection is going to be, it's really important, and it's very important in the way I've come to see assessment. So we'll be talking, coming back to it. Right, so we've been round once. Tell me something else that changes.
I don't know if it was mentioned maybe indirectly, but the idea of questioning
No, that's not been mentioned.
versus matter of fact kind of thinking. So moving more into questioning.
Yes.
Something
So,
more.
yes, I mean, in a way, there are two there, but I'm going to pick up on questioning. I don't think there are any questions in the first account. The second account has lots of questions in it, but there are no, she doesn't answer them. She says, she asks herself something, but she doesn't answer it. In a way, I think that is part of moving towards deeper reflection. Quite a lot of work is done with students where students are asked questions. And actually, I think I'm making a slightly different point here, but let me just say it anyway. I think if students are simply asked a question and we expect to answer it, and it might be a question like, how did you feel about that thing? And it kind of prompts them into that thinking, but I do think that it's so much easier to answer a question and much more difficult to actually generate the questions. So later on in the accounts, although the questions are not overt, they are, the issues are dealt with in the text. So I think that there is a sort of stage of reflection where you just sort of realise the issues. Hello, there's an issue there, but I'm not going to deal with it. So yes, thank you. There's a questioning pattern changes. Right, I think that there are one or two left.
There is also, we have here, in the last one, there is an element of self-help therapy. So they use this whole experience to deal with an issue that was present.
Yes, she's sort of using it. I mean, obviously, the park incident could have kicked off any number of sequences of stories. I mean, this is just one sequence. And it could have gone much more in that direction. And as I say, there could be 6th, 7th, 8th, I'm sure. I wouldn't like to try and write them, but... Okay, any more points? Hold on to the questions for a moment. Any other issues that sequences?
Yeah, at some point, I think in the third one, she raised possible things that she could have done to, possible like to translate her worries into actions.
Yes.
Like it could have called the ambulance, it could have, so, she thought of a plan of action,
Right.
although she'd not...
Okay, now that's a really useful point. It's not on my list of things, although it's very much more evident in the GP story, the other sequence I use fairly regularly. Sometimes on sequences of these sort of stories, maybe the last two stages, there's a sense of action. What would I do better next time? That starts to be contemplated. I don't know, and it really doesn't matter, I don't know whether that is part of reflection or whether it is an action that results from reflection. it doesn't matter, it's just to see. I mean, if you see the declaration of a line of action as being an important outcome of reflection, you know, that's what you just must say to students. As I say, I sort of see it as an outcome separate from the reflection itself, but in some of the sequences I actually do put the action in. So it's a good one to notice. Okay, what I'm going to do now is half a tick. Let me just go through the list. I think there's only one that you haven't got. You're really good at this. I do find students very good at this too. Something's happened.
Yes.
She has the second.
One more, which is language.
Yes, okay.
The way language develops from the beginning to the end.
Actually, that is one more, so I will pick it up. Thank you very much. The first, okay, here's another one. The first one I just described as very descriptive. It is like the story is being told. That changes, and that descriptive piece contracts from being a long story with irrelevances in it to a precise bit of language, a bit of description that kicks into the reflection. This is what I'm going to reflect on, so this is its context. If I'm just lounging around and I start reflecting, I don't sort of sit down and describe what I'm going to reflect on. But if I'm in an academic context, and we're asking students to do this sort of work, you, if you're a tutor, need to know what it is the student's reflecting on. So a little bit of good description is important, but it should take up just a few lines, and the reflection is then the rest. Okay, thank you. Right.
Can I have one more?
Oh, great.
Effort, mental effort that goes into that. Because in the beginning, if you think mental effort. Yeah.
Oh, right, now I think you have got the last one now.
Yeah, thinking slow and thinking fast. I mean, thinking fast and thinking slow in Kahneman words. The system one, first, you know, it's just effortless thinking about what happened and going into more rationalization, and the system two thinking where you start rationalizing and actually draw some conclusions.
Okay, I think that, I think I'm going to modify slightly what you've said to the last one, but I think you're on a point there. That yes, I mean the first one is just a sort of relaxed story. What happens is increased self-challenging, and she is challenging herself, so it becomes more effortful. I agree, and I think we've now actually covered the whole list. I think. Okay, description to reflective account. No questions to questions to responding to questions within the text. The emotional influence. There is a standing back from the event. There's an increasing self-questioning and a challenging to her own ideas. There's a recognition of the relevance of prior experience. There's a recognition of the relevance of other people's views. And lastly, there is metacognition or reflexivity, of thinking about her own processes. I think largely that covers what is the transition between a very descriptive, superficial coverage of the content to a deeper account. And in your handouts, if you go over one page, you'll see, some of you have done that, you'll see this list. And then beyond that, there is a model called the Framework for Reflective Writing that describes the transition from superficial writing to deep writing. Actually, is it directly afterwards, or is there a commentary on the part? Right, okay. Check. Okay, sorry, directly afterwards there's a commentary on the park. Actually, for years I used to take this out, but with this park exercise, I wrote this quite early on, and I've left it in now because I think people sometimes find it quite helpful just to think about the transitions within the accounts. Then if you go one further over, it says a generic framework for reflective writing. And that is a model that backs up all these reflective writing exercises. It is in 4 parts. I don't see the 4 parts as directly corresponding to the 4 parts of the park, but they are 2 continua. Some of the exercises I've written like this, as I say, there are 7 of them. Some of them are in 3 parts anyway, but I think the 4 parts gives a bit more time for consideration. Right. It's nearly time for a break. I think I will... Right, any questions, anything you want to raise?
I was wondering, since you brought up what's best for practice with the students, and we noted that there is a difference in the reflection that comes immediately after some work and a delayed kind of reflection. And you mentioned also that it's good to revisit your reflection. So would it be a good idea to have them write immediately and then come and write later on? It will be like a revision of their, and have them consciously look at what they wrote immediately to try to,
I think it depends where it fits for you. I think the main thing is for you to know that difference. I would say that always it is worth getting students in some context or other to do secondary reflection. I think it is you lose a lot of the value of reflective writing if they just write raw reflection straight after an event, perhaps, and then never see it again. You'll see I come back to that in assessment because I've caught up those ideas in the way I talk about assessment. And I won't say too much about that just at the moment because we'll come back onto it. But I think in some way or other it is always worth getting students to go back. One of the things they really often learn of great value is how much they have changed.
Yeah.
They realise that what they wrote in the first terms of doing this kind of, in the first sessions of doing this kind of writing, how much they have learned and how much deeper they can write. And that's really helpful to them. They realise that they've actually changed themselves in the way they tackle this sort of work. So I would say, know the difference, and design your work accordingly. And probably it does mean then, you sort of getting them to go back over into in some way. Well, it does mean that, but somehow fit it in. Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Well, I guess again concerning teacher-student setting, you mentioned at the beginning to really try and clarify what us as teachers mean by reflective learning. And I was wondering also if we ought to clarify something else, because you mentioned that there might be challenges to to students like shaping their reflection to fit with what they think the teacher expects of them.
Yeah.
I was thinking that maybe the teacher from the start can explain to them his or her expectation, a framework of the reflection.
Yes.
I don't know if you talked about this.
Well, in a way, I suppose when I give you the generic framework for reflective writing, the idea is that students have that as well. So if they do this exercise fairly early on in their reflective writing, you actually, in a sense, have given them a framework that you can then work with yourselves. It does, if you want some sort of assessment rubric for the depth of reflection, for the quality of reflection, it kind of gives you that. You can modify the language in order to work it out. I mean, I've given you the things that I think change between superficial and deep reflection. You can use this as a sort of teaching, a set of teaching ideas and just work to this, and I don't think they'll be too far wrong. It is worth saying to them, though, that other people may have different views of what reflection is. Now, I wouldn't say that to students too early on. You'll see that from the next exercise. It's very much about the quality of the thinking of students that changes across the progress through a higher education programme, and that's the next exercise. And I think that students early on expect there to be a right way and a wrong way, and they will find it difficult if you say, they'll find it difficult if you say, this is my way of doing it, but so-and-so down the corridor may have a different way of doing it, especially if they come across reflective writing in several different contexts. But I think all that will fall into place when we've done that, what we'll do later on this morning. Yes.
So basically, we think we should start with some kind of imitation of reflection, and then as they do it more and they practice it more in the process, then they'll find their own way.
I think that's true, yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that perhaps a way of doing this is to run the an exercise like the park. And remember, you have all the materials you need now to write these exercises for yourselves. There's something else I need to say about that. You've got the framework, so you can actually write your own material and you know, based on the framework, if that's helpful to you. Or modify the framework, you know, you use it as you wish. But I always suggest that you might want to run this twice, something like this twice. You run it once right early on with the aim of helping students just to know what reflective writing looks like. And you might only want to sort of run it fairly quickly and just so that they see what reflective writing looks like. Then at a later stage, when you have probably got most students writing something, but probably very superficially, because that's sort of the pathway they will take, then you actually say, right, I now need to move you on to writing at a deeper level, and then you introduce it, you can go through it again, and you know, deepen their thinking about reflection, so that they really then focus on what makes deeper reflective writing. I am not suggesting they all need to be writing at the depth of the park, but I think if you show it to them, they know what it looks like. So I often suggest that really 2 goes of this is not a bad thing.
This is mainly the personal reflection. We're not talking about groups, right? Like a community of 4 or 5 students working on a project, and then you've asked them to work together on a reflection piece, because then the
That's
eye,
interesting, yes.
So it would be eye level.
Well, they then confront other issues about negotiating the points they put down, which kind of adds another layer to it. But I think broadly speaking, they would still be wanting to look at the deep. And what it does is modifies the notions of having different people's perspectives.
Yeah, but in let's say, in e-reflection or e-portfolios,
yes,
where instead of just talking about their experience, they're actually negotiating with the other students about the same experience that they did. You see what I mean? So they might argue against a certain point. And I think there's value in this, because then, again, going back to the idea of technical structure, it's the idea of, it might be relative, this is how I perceive it, and then they can, I think...
in a way, I think I would probably, although it really doesn't matter what I'm about to say, I would probably call that critical thinking. But critical thinking involves reflection, and reflection involves critical thinking. Generally speaking, I've written 2 completely separate books about reflection and critical thinking. And it was only at the end of the work on critical thinking that I thought, right, how do I deal with the same issues that you've just dealt with reflection, with critical thinking? How do I show students what it looks like? And how do I then sort of say that you can either, half a tick, let me deal with this. How can I show them what it looks like? Or how can I show them that there is very superficial critical thinking, or there's much deeper critical thinking? Because I've worked through in my book to say that, and for reasons that will again be backed up in the next session, the next last later part of the morning. I think superficially critical thinking and reflection are fairly different, because I think on the whole with critical thinking, you are, and this is why I'm saying that maybe we could call what you're talking about critical thinking, you are working towards an independent judgment. There is a kind of end point of critical thinking. Whereas reflection, the end point is more generalized learning or further exploration. It's more exploratory. At depth, a lot of what...
Or change.
Or change, yes. Yes. And that wouldn't be part of critical thinking. You know, it might be part of it, but it's not the sort of... I would say the outcome of critical thinking is an independent judgment. And a real central word that for me is independent judgment. I think we actually are working with students right through all their degrees to work towards them being able to make independent judgments in their disciplines, in the context in which we've worked with them. At depth, there are many characteristics of critical thinking and reflective learning that are in common. And as I say, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, certainly metacognition, it's really important to think through your argument and all that sort of thing. There's a lot in common at depth. And I have got an exercise, or 2 exercises that I've sent in fact to Amal this morning on critical thinking that use exactly the same pattern of work, but work to a different framework. So they have all the same components as well. There's the story and the force up in 4 parts, and the sort of the things that change, and the framework for critical thinking that underpins it. Not so different from this, but it's, you know, there are different elements to it.
I wonder if we're dealing with the undergraduates in early years, if we give them options of topics, because sometimes you're not inspired by a question that you're asked to provide a reflective essay on. So is this something that is practiced, or you have to challenge them to write on this specific?
Okay, again, I'm kind of going to make reference to something else, because there are lots and lots of things that you could do with students in the context of reflective writing. It doesn't just have to be, you know, write an account of what you've just done and reflect on it. There are loads of interesting activities that actually promote students thinking at greater depth without them realising what they're doing. Now they're in a handout that, again, as I say, I sent to Amal this morning on more in the context of learning journals. It's a self-instructional sort of guide to learning journals, based on a workshop I do on learning journals. And there are a number of different exercises in there that help to deepen reflection. One of them, I will describe it now. I don't think we'll have time to do it, and it does sound a bit odd if I describe it, so bear with me and try it out if you think that it might be of use to you. It's on using dialogues. Okay, so if I have a discussion with a friend and I want to reflect on it, one way of doing that for myself is actually to rerun bits of that discussion. Not copy it, but to develop bits of that discussion, but on my own. And what I might do is write my name, and then I sort of say, hello, friend, you know, we were discussing something, and I want to think a bit further about an issue associated with it. And then write the friend's name, or a name, and just get a feeling for what the person's response is. Now, if you think about it, that part of the deepening of reflection is to actually look at things from other people's perspectives. So immediately you're kind of trying to view an issue from somebody else's perspective. Okay, you're not talking to that person, but you are trying to to listen to them in your head. Okay. See on a day-to-day basis now, who you can't actually discuss it with, but you feel that person has a sense that, you know, added wisdom to your thinking. So you have a dialogue about something with that person on paper. That doesn't need to be a mentor. It might be somebody who you never have met, somebody who you feel is a wise theorist, Freud, or, you know, choose any theorist who you're interested in. Have a conversation with that person about a particular thing. Now, okay, it doesn't need to be a person. It could be a political party or a racial group. It doesn't, so you can have a conversation with something different. However, it doesn't need to be a person or people. It could be a work of art or design. So you actually say, hello, sculpture, I'm stuck with that bit, that corner. I don't know how to do it. Tell me what I should do. Now this sounds silly, and this is why I warned you, just listen and try it out. It is amazing how sometimes you get insights into ideas by just shifting your perspective a little bit. I run this work, I do this work with research students sometimes on their research projects. And I remember very much one research student who was doing work on the writer George Eliot. And she chose to have a dialogue. We'd done some work on this, and she chose to have a dialogue with George Eliot. And she was so excited when she finished. She said she'd got really blocked, and she'd now found a completely new way of working with the subject matter. And I love doing this exercise personally, because actually quite often people have dialogues with a problem they've got, or somebody who in their lives is a problem. And it's quite frequently that somebody will say, wow, I've come up with a solution through doing this exercise. I think it's a really useful professional tool, and it has all sorts of applications. I've just been doing a creative writing MA, and I found it really useful in writing a play, because I had dialogues with the various characters, and it was amazing what better insights I got into them through doing a kind of dialogue on paper. So that is one example of many different exercises you can do in the context of reflective writing. And by doing that sort of thing, you're not saying to students, I want you to write at greater depth. You're kind of giving them a structure which will cause them to do it. Okay, one more question.
Get back to the group work, because I think that there's some reflection that one can do about the group process that might be important.
Yes.
So my role in moving, what is my role in a group? What are the importance of having different people with different
Yes.
skills in a group, and reflecting on the process of group work itself, perhaps not the product, but the process. I think has some value in this sense, if we're thinking about it not as an individual, but as a group.
Right, yes, well I agree with you. I mean, if it's any help and if it's an issue to you, I hesitate to keep saying I've got things on this. I did quite a lot of work writing around a term that I developed called academic assertiveness. My sense was that as a critical thinker, to develop critical thinking, you need to be reasonably assertive. You need to be able to put forward your viewpoints. You need to be able to challenge. So actually it requires a certain level of kind of assertiveness. You can call it what you like. It might not be an appropriate word for some students in some situations. But, choose where you're word. But I think you need, and students actually don't, and they need to learn to fail as well. And we don't do much work on that. All of that I encompass in academic assertiveness. And somebody asked me to use that idea in relation to group work. And so I've got a set of materials, which again I can, put on the website, on doing a bit of work with students on academic assertiveness, getting them to read, I think it's about 16 pages of material about standing up for themselves, basically. Just the very raw bones of it, with lots of little scenarios and stories in it to illustrate it. And then they do some discussion of particular case situations. And in the group that they're actually going to work in, so that they've started to voice some of the issues that happen in groups that are sometimes not helpful or may happen later. And having voiced them, it's much easier for them to discuss it. So if you want that material, I will endeavour to remember to put it on the website and to send it to Amar. Yeah. And that's all there. You've got everything you need to run it if you want that material.